The Civil War is renowned for the introduction and employment of many new weapons, including rifled artillery, machine guns, and submarines. To this list should also be added railroads.
I would say that the three most important game-changing technologies of the American Civil War were the railroad, the use of the telegraph, and the development of the mini bullet and the rifled musket. The railroads probably did more to strategically change how warfare occurred, because the speed of moving troops, the speed of moving munitions to the front was unheard of in world warfare. So we have a case here where we have a technology that has never been used in a major land war before. We create time efficiencies. We have more goods and services being moved to the troops and to and from the battlefield, really, than we've ever seen in the history of the America, and certainly in the history of the war. It really was a game changer.
During the war, railroads were second only to waterways in providing logistical support for the armies. They also transported siege guns, were troop carriers, and were even used for reconnaissance. Railroads became a mania that swept America and Europe during the early years of the 19th century.
We find the first tracks being laid west of Baltimore here in 1830. The company was formed earlier in 1827. So between those 3 years, stock was sold both to the city of Baltimore, to the state of Maryland, and to private investors to finance this spectacular gamble, as it was called. Now, this spectacular gamble was the first long-distance railroad ever conceived in the world, and it was designed to go from the city of Baltimore all the way out to the Ohio River to capture the goods that would have been taken by the Erie Canal up to New York.
The earliest railroads were not always met with universal love. They were in commercial competition with canals, which were often the source of regional pride and a sign of political power.
During the earlier part of the Industrial Revolution, the United States was involved in a canal building period. The Erie Canal was tremendously successful. Seeing that as a model, investors began to construct the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which would have taken traffic from Washington, D.C. to the Ohio River. This would have been a tremendous competition against the Port of Baltimore, and to prevent this, they chartered a railroad, named it the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and its mission was to build a railroad from the docks of Baltimore to the Ohio River and secure the traffic from the Ohio Valley to the Port of Baltimore.
Eventually, railroad companies were able to bend public sentiment their way. A combination of land grants, subsidies, and private investments led to a railroad building surge in the 1850s.
What we see after the concept of the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad is what we might call a railroad boom throughout the East Coast. Once the technology came to this country, companies in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, way down in the South, in Georgia, up in New England, all creating railroads.
Many of the first railroads provided passenger as well as freight service, paralleling the canals or careening across the landscape from one population center to another.
But in the beginning, they were short lines, as it were, to go from here to there and things like that. But while the B&O adopted the English standard gauge in railroading, many of the other railroads around the country created wider gauges, more narrow gauges, because the engines could be lighter, they could be less expensively constructed, or for various reasons, because of tight clearances, gauges were changed. So by the opening of the American Civil War, we have kind of a patchwork of railroads throughout the South and throughout the North, although they were far more developed in the North than they were in the South because of the needs of industry.
This patchwork system of rail from industrial center to industrial center would benefit the North when war came. As the railroads grew, so did railroad technology.
If we look at the early type of locomotives and cars that were developed, they were very lightweight and small. principally designed to crawl slowly through tight spaces in the American terrain. But as the years progressed, more and more demand on the railroad to carry more people, to carry more and heavier freight and goods, created a need for more powerful locomotives. If you look at the ability to try to get across a mountain or through a valley, you find that the motive power, these steam engines that were developed in America, had to be bigger, they had to be stronger, they had to pull more and more people, they had to pull more and more freight. So we find the size of the locomotives growing at a great and rapid rate between the 1830s and the 1850s. By the time the Civil War opens, we have well-developed American locomotives that could reach speeds of up to 60 miles an hour and pull almost 50 cars of freight versus the early engines that could carry one or two.
These developments would mean a great deal when the railroads were ordered to carry the tools of war to far-flung battlefields.
By the opening guns of the American Civil War, we have well-developed large locomotives that are able to carry almost 100 cars of freight and or people. Sometimes there were mixed freight and passenger trains. But we find a well-developed technology, speeds of which could reach up to 60 miles an hour.
By the 1860s, as the railroads grew, so did the fracture between the North and South, one industrialized and the other agricultural.
Railroading in the North had developed for two solid reasons. Because of the population centers that were larger in the North, cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York that were growing, we find railroads designed to carry both passengers and freight. And speed and efficiency were more importance of those as those railroads developed. When you go down to the South, where we have a very agrarian economy, we find railroads that, yes, were developed to carry passengers, but not with the ease of efficiency. Distances were a little bit longer in the South, but also they were primarily designed to carry freight, and that would be the freight of the South. So it was fruits and vegetables and cotton and the goods that were being produced in the South, mostly to get them from the plantations and the fields over to a port where, goods could be shipped either up north or off to Europe.
These economic, political, and cultural differences would soon explode into armed conflict.